19. That was all it took for her life to be reduced to a signature on a debt collector's ledger. The town gathered to watch her get sold to a feral mountain man. They expected a tragedy. They didn't expect the wedding gift that would bring them to their knees. Dust hung thick in the rafters of the Oakhaven parish, catching the harsh afternoon light like suspended ash. Cora stood at the front, her back rigid against the rough-hewn pine of the altar. She was 19, though the hollows under her cheekbones and the flat, deadened look in her brown eyes belonged to a much older, much more tired woman. Her dress, dyed a cheap mourning black, smelled faintly of lye soap and mothballs. It was suffocating her, tight across the ribs, but she refused to pull at the collar. The entire town of Oakhaven had crammed into the pews. Ostensibly, they were there to witness a legal transfer of debt. In reality, they were there for the blood sport. Josiah Trent, the town's mayor and chief creditor, stood beside her. He sweated profusely through his linen shirt, dabbing his thick neck with a yellowed handkerchief. Cora's father had died 3 weeks ago in a silver mine collapse. They hadn't even found enough of him to fill a pine box, leaving Cora with nothing but an empty whiskey jug and a ledger of debts, so long it could have spooled out the church doors. Trent owned her father's house. Trent owned the claim, and, by the brutal, unwritten laws of the territory, Trent practically owned her. "The estate of the deceased falls woefully short," Trent announced, his voice booming off the timber walls and echoing over the congregation. "Miss Cora has agreed to a union to settle the accounts. A suitor has stepped forward to assume the debt in full." A low murmur rippled through the pews. Mrs. Higgins, the apothecary's wife, leaned over and whispered something to her neighbor, hiding her mouth behind a gloved hand. Cora didn't need to hear the words. She knew exactly what they were saying. Sold like a broken-down mare. Traded for a bar tab and a plot of dirt. The heavy oak doors at the back of the church groaned open, the hinges screeching in the dry air. The murmurs died instantly. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. He filled the doorway. Boone. Just Boone. No one knew his last name, or if he even had one. He was a mountain man, a ghost who only came down from the jagged peaks of the serrated ridge twice a year to trade beaver pelts for coffee, salt, and black powder. He stepped inside, his boots heavy and caked in dried red mud. The scent of him arrived before he did pine pitch, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of old blood. He wore a coat made of thick, uncarded wool, and a wide leather belt studded with tarnished brass. A heavy bone-handled hunting knife rested against his thigh. His face was a map of hard weather and bad luck. A pale, jagged scar slashed through his thick brown beard, pulling the left side of his mouth into a permanent, slight grimace. His eyes were the color of dirty river ice, pale, cold, and entirely unreadable. Cora's stomach contracted into a tight, hard knot. She didn't tremble. She wouldn't give Oakhaven the satisfaction of her tears. But her fingernails bit so deeply into her palms that she felt the skin yield. Boone walked down the center aisle. The floorboards shrieked under his weight. He didn't look at the townsfolk shrinking back in their pews. He didn't look at Mayor Trent. He looked only at Cora. His gaze wasn't leering, and it wasn't triumphant. It was heavy and clinical, like he was assessing the structural integrity of a bridge he had to cross. He reached the altar, reached a hand into his heavy canvas duster, and pulled out a worn leather pouch. He tossed it onto the communion table. It hit the wood with a dull, heavy times thud. It didn't jingle like coins. It clunked, raw, unrefined river gold. Trent's eyes bulged. He scrambled to open the pouch, his fat fingers shaking as he sifted through the dull yellow nuggets, weighing them greedily in his palm. "Paid?" Trent breathed, a bead of sweat dripping from his nose. "Paid in full. The debt is cleared. The girl is yours." Boone didn't say a word. He turned to Cora and extended a massive, calloused hand. Dirt was packed deep beneath his fingernails. His knuckles were severely scarred, the skin thick and shiny. Cora stared at the hand. The church held its collective breath. She could feel the eyes of the women who used to buy eggs from her mother, the men who used to drink with her father. They were waiting for her to break, to drop to her knees and beg for mercy. She lifted her chin, bypassed his outstretched hand entirely, and stepped down from the altar. "My things are on the porch," she said, her voice as dry as dead leaves. Boone slowly lowered his arm. He gave a single, short grunt that might have been acknowledgement. He didn't seem offended by the slight. He simply turned and followed her out, leaving the town of Oakhaven to choke on their own dust and gossip. The ride up the ridge was a brutal, bone-rattling ascent that stripped away whatever numb bravado Cora had mustered in the church. She sat sideways on a sway-backed mule, her small canvas grip clutched white-knuckled in her lap. Boone rode ahead on a massive roan gelding that looked as ill-tempered as the mountain itself. They had been riding for 4 hours, leaving the scrub, oak, and dry dirt of the valley behind for towering, ancient pines. The temperature had plummeted with every mile of elevation. The air grew thin and sharp, biting aggressively at the exposed skin of Cora's wrists and neck. The silence between them was an almost physical weight, pressing down on her chest. Boone hadn't spoken a single word since they left the town limits. He just rode, his broad back swaying with the rhythmic, plodding gait of his horse. Cora's mind spun in tight, panicked circles. She had heard the stories. The town boys claimed Boone had killed a man in a territorial dispute with his bare hands. The women whispered that he had taken a bride years ago and left her to freeze, or that he was more feral animal than human. She didn't know what was true. She only knew she was entirely at his mercy, miles away from the nearest sheriff, ascending into a wilderness that routinely swallowed people whole. Slowly, carefully, she slipped her right hand into her coat pocket. Her fingers traced the wooden handle of a small, painfully sharp paring knife she had stolen from Mayor Trent's kitchen before they departed. It was a pathetic weapon. Against a man of Boone's sheer mass, it was barely a thorn, but feeling the cold metal of the blade against her fingertips kept the rising tide of hysteria at bay. The trail narrowed, hugging the edge of a sheer, dizzying drop. Loose shale clattered down the abyss, the sound fading into nothingness before it ever hit bottom. Cora closed her eyes, vertigo washing over her, and gripped the saddle horn until her joints ached. Lean left. The voice startled her so badly she jolted, nearly slipping from the saddle. It was deep and grating, like two stones grinding together. She snapped her eyes open to see Boone looking back over his shoulder. "Mule favors his right front leg," Boone said, his face entirely expressionless. "Lean left. Keeps him balanced so he don't stumble." He turned back around before she could answer. Cora swallowed hard, her mouth dry, and shifted her weight slightly. The mule's gait instantly smoothed out. She hated that he was right. She hated the quiet competence of it. Dusk was bleeding the color out of the sky by the time they reached the clearing. The cabin sat tucked beneath a thick canopy of pines, camouflaged against the darkening mountain. It wasn't a cozy, rustic retreat from a dime novel. It was a fortress, built strictly for survival. Thick, unpeeled logs were heavily chinked with dried mud and horsehair. A heavy stone chimney puffed a thin ribbon of gray smoke into the twilight. Boone dismounted and tied his roan to a hitching post. He walked over to her mule. He didn't offer a hand this time either. He just stood there, waiting as she clumsily slid off the saddle. Her legs turned to jelly the moment her boots hit the frozen dirt. She stumbled, catching herself hard against the mule's flank, gasping as pain shot up her arm. Boone simply unstrapped her canvas grip from the mule's pack, carried it to the heavy timber door, and pushed it open. He stepped inside, leaving her standing alone in the freezing wind. Cora took a deep, shuddering breath. This is it, she thought, the reality of her situation crashing down on her. This is where it happens. She tightened her grip on the hidden knife, squared her shoulders, and walked through the door. The inside of the cabin smelled intensely of wood ash, cured venison, and old leather. It was one large, shadowy room. A massive fieldstone hearth dominated the far wall, radiating a faint, residual heat from the morning's fire. There was a rough-hewn wooden table, 2 chairs, and in the corner, a single heavy wooden bed frame piled thick with wolf and bear furs. One bed. Cora's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stood frozen just inside the doorway, the cold drafts licking at her ankles. Boone ignored her entirely. He moved around the cabin with a quiet, efficient grace that defied his hulking size. He struck a match against the stone fireplace, the sharp smell of sulfur briefly cutting through the scent of meat, and tossed a few logs onto the embers, coaxing a fire back to life. He filled a blackened cast-iron pot from a wooden bucket of water and hung it over the growing flames. Then he finally turned to her. In the flickering firelight, the jagged scar on his face cast a long, ugly shadow across his cheek. Cora panicked. She backed up until her shoulders hit the heavy wooden door. She pulled the paring knife from her pocket, holding it awkwardly in front of her chest. Her hand shook so violently the blade vibrated, catching the orange light of the fire. "I won't," she breathed, her voice cracking, stripping away her stoic facade. "I swear to God, I'll put this in your neck if you touch me." Boone stopped dead in the center of the room. He looked at the trembling knife. Then he looked up at her face. He didn't laugh. He didn't get angry. His expression didn't change at all. He reached up, slowly, keeping his hands where she could see them, and unbuttoned his heavy canvas duster. He shrugged it off and tossed it over one of the wooden chairs. Underneath, he wore a faded, sweat-stained flannel shirt that strained across his broad shoulders. Cora braced herself, raising the knife an inch higher, her breathing ragged. Boone walked past her. He didn't even brush her shoulder. He walked to the far corner of the cabin, picked up a heavy canvas bedroll, and carried it to the hearth. He dropped it onto the rough floorboards, kicking it unrolled with the heel of his boot. "Stew's cold. Bread's in the tin," Boone muttered, turning his broad back to her. He sat heavily on the floor, pulling off his boots with a grunt. "Bed's yours. Don't bleed on the pelts if you cut yourself." Cora stood perfectly still, the paring knife suddenly feeling incredibly heavy and deeply ridiculous in her hand. She stared at his back as he lay down on the hard floorboards, pulling a coarse wool blanket over his shoulders. Within minutes, the deep, rhythmic sound of his breathing filled the small cabin. He was asleep. Cora slowly lowered the knife, her mind entirely blank. The blind terror that had fueled her for the last 6 hours evaporated, leaving behind a confusing, hollow exhaustion that ached in her bones. She looked at the large, comfortable bed in the corner. She looked at the massive man sleeping on the drafty floor. Nothing made sense. The town had sold her to a monster, but the monster had just given her his bed and gone to sleep. She didn't take her boots off. She walked over to the bed, perched on the very edge of the furs, and kept her fingers wrapped tightly around the wooden handle of the knife in her lap. She sat there in her morning dress, staring at the fire, listening to the wind howl against the logs, waiting for the trap to spring. But the night remained painfully, resolutely silent. Cora did not sleep that first night. She lay rigid beneath the crushing weight of the bare furs, her eyes tracking the dying embers in the hearth, listening to the wind screwing against the logs. She waited for the trap to spring. She waited for the heavy floorboards to creak under Boone's boots. They never did. When the gray, anemic light of dawn finally bled through the cabin's single grease paper window, Boone was already gone. The heavy canvas bedroll by the hearth was empty, neatly folded. A fresh fire popped and hissed in the grate, driving back the bitter mountain chill. On the rough-hewn table sat a tin cup of chicory coffee, steaming into the cold air, and beside it lay her stolen paring knife. Boone had sharpened it. The edge gleamed, a silent acknowledgement that he knew she had it. He knew why she carried it, and he wasn't going to take it away. Cora stared at the knife for a long time. Then she picked up the coffee. It was bitter, muddy, and tasted faintly of wood smoke. It was the best thing she had ever swallowed. The weeks that followed settled into a brutal, wordless rhythm. The mountain did not allow for the luxury of fear. It demanded sweat. There was no romance in the cabin, only survival. Cora quickly learned that her morning dress was a hazard. It snagged on firewood and dragged in the freezing mud. On the 4th day, she found a pair of men's canvas trousers and a thick woolen shirt left at the foot of her bed. She put them on. They swallowed her frame, but they were warm. She started working. Not because Boone asked her to, but because the silence of the cabin left too much room for the ghosts of Oakhaven to creep in. She hauled water from the frozen creek, the ice crusting on the hemp rope, burning her palms raw. She split kindling until her shoulders seized and her breath plumed in ragged, white clouds. She expected Boone to stop her, to tell her to tend a pot or mend a sock. Instead, he simply handed her a heavier axe. He was a man constructed of silence. He communicated in grunts, nods, and the division of labor. He would disappear into the tree line before sunrise with his rifle, returning at dusk, smelling of pine, pitch, and raw copper blood, carrying a field-dressed buck or a brace of snowshoe hares. He would drop the meat on the butchering stump, hand Cora a skinning knife, and start sharpening his own. They worked side by side in the freezing twilight. The smell of rendering tallow and raw meat filled the air. Her hands, once soft and ink-stained from keeping her father's books, transformed. Blisters rose, popped, wept, clear fluid, and eventually hardened into thick, yellow calluses. Her fingernails chipped. The dirt became a permanent fixture in the creases of her knuckles. One evening, as she struggled to pull a heavy cast-iron Dutch oven from the fire, the handle slipped. The searing metal branded the inside of her wrist. Cora dropped the pot with a clatter, biting down on a scream, pressing the burn to her chest. She expected a reprimand for wasting the stew. Boone stood up from the corner, where he was oiling his rifle. He crossed the room, his heavy boots silent on the floorboards, and grabbed her wrist. His grip was entirely devoid of gentleness, yet it wasn't cruel, it was simply absolute. He dragged her hand toward the light of the fire, inspecting the angry red blister forming on her pale skin. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He turned away, rummaged in his pack, and produced a small tin of foul-smelling bear grease and a strip of clean linen. "Hold still," he grated out. It was the first time he had spoken in 4 days. He smeared the grease over the burn. It stung fiercely, then quickly numbed. He wrapped the linen tight. His hands were massive, the scarred knuckles brushing against her skin. Cora looked up at his face. The jagged scar cut deep into his beard. His pale eyes focused entirely on the knot he was tying. There was a profound contradiction in him. The town of Oakhaven had sold her to a monster, but the monster had given her his bed, armed her with an axe, and was now patching her up like a prized hunting dog. He didn't look at her with the greasy, entitled hunger she had seen in Mayor Trent's eyes. He looked at her like she was part of the crew on a sinking ship. They were just two people bailing water. "Works hard," Boone muttered, stepping back and tossing the tin onto the table. "Hands gotta be harder. Stop grabbing iron without a rag." Cora looked down at the bandage. The blind, panic-stricken girl who had ridden up the mountain was dead. The mountain had frozen her out. In her place was someone quieter, someone sharper. "I'll remember," she said, her voice steady. She didn't reach for the paring knife in her pocket that night. The first heavy snow of December threatened to bury the valley. The sky bruised a deep, violent purple, and the air smelled heavily of ozone and frost. "Town," Boone announced over a plate of salted elk. "Flour, salt, kerosene. Pass closes by Sunday." Cora's chest tightened, a phantom ache returning to her ribs. Oakhaven. The very name tasted like grit and copper. She hadn't seen another human face in 3 months. The thought of riding back into that muddy street, of facing the smirks of the women, and the smug, victorious sneer of Mayor Trent, made her stomach roll. But she didn't argue. She went to the corner and began packing the canvas grip. When she reached for her thin black morning dress, a heavy weight landed on the bed beside her. It was a coat. Thick, brain-tanned buckskin, lined with heavy silver wolf fur. The leather was supple, smelling of wood smoke and sage. "Wear that," Boone said, already walking out the door to saddle the horses. "Dress'll kill you in the wind." The ride down the ridge was agonizingly slow, the horses picking their way through fetlock-deep snow. Cora wore the wolf fur coat. It was heavy, a physical armor against the biting cold and the impending stairs. She rode with her back straight. She wasn't shaking. When they finally broke the tree line and descended into Oakhaven, the town looked exactly as pathetic and gray as she remembered. Mud churned in the main thoroughfare, freezing into deep ruts. The wooden facades of the buildings looked tired and leaning. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. The blacksmith stopped his hammer. The women shaking rugs on their porches froze. The door to the saloon swung open, and men spilled out onto the boardwalk, their breath pluming in the cold air, eager for a show. They were waiting to see the broken, hollowed-out girl they had sold to the mountain. Cora kept her chin high. She let them see the leather trousers, the heavy boots, the wolf fur coat, and the hard, uncompromising set of her jaw. She didn't look like a captive. She looked like the winter itself. They stopped the horses in front of the mercantile. Josiah Trent's name was painted in peeling gold letters across the glass. The door jingled, and Trent stepped out onto the porch. He wore a heavy wool suit and a gold pocket watch chain draped across his expansive belly. He stopped when he saw them, a slow, oily grin spreading across his face. He wiped his sweaty palms on his thighs. "Well, well," Trent boomed, his voice carrying down the quiet street, ensuring an audience. "If it ain't the mountain bride, you bring her back, Boone? She too much trouble to feed? I told you she was a frail little bird." A few of the men on the boardwalk chuckled. Cora felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't break Trent's gaze. Boone dismounted. He didn't tie the horse. He walked up the wooden steps of the mercantile, his heavy boots thudding like a drum beat. He stopped a foot away from Trent, towering over the mare, blocking out the gray sun. Boone didn't speak to Trent. He reached into the inner pocket of his canvas duster and pulled out a thick, heavy oilskin folio, bound in twine. He turned, stepped back down into the muddy street, and walked over to Cora's horse. He didn't hand the folio to Trent. He held it up to Cora. "Wedding gift," Boone said. His deep, grating voice echoed off the timber buildings. Cora took the folio. It was heavy. Her raw, calloused fingers untied the twine. The town of Oakhaven leaned in, a collective breath held in the freezing air. She pulled out a thick stack of papers. They were official territorial documents, stamped with the heavy red wax seal of the governor's office in the capital. She flipped through the heavy parchment, her eyes scanning the dense legal script. Deed of ownership. Silver Creek claim. Deed of ownership. Oakhaven mercantile and attached land. Deed of ownership. Oakhaven parish and surrounding acreages. Cora's breath caught in her throat. She looked at the signatures. They were all signed over to Times Cora Hayes. "Your daddy didn't die broke," Boone said, his voice loud enough for the entire street to hear. "He hit the mother lode 3 days before the mine collapsed. Hid the strike," Trent found out. "Caused the cave-in to claim the land. I found your daddy's camp up on the ridge. Found his map. Found his gold." Trent's face drained of all color. The oily grin vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed, horrified mask. "That's a lie," he sputtered, taking a step forward. "That's slander." "You feral bastard. I'll have the marshals hang you." Boone didn't even look at him. He kept his pale eyes locked on Cora. "Rode to the capital while you were chopping wood. Bought the town's debt from the territorial bank using your daddy's gold. Put it in your name. All of it." The silence in the street was absolute. It was suffocating. It was the sound of 100 people simultaneously realizing that the dirt beneath their boots, the roofs over their heads, and the ledgers that held their lives hostage no longer belonged to Josiah Trent. They belonged to the 19-year-old girl they had sold for sport. Cora stared at the papers. Her hands, rough and strong from 2 months of an axe handle, didn't tremble. She looked at the town, at the women who had whispered behind their hands, at the men who had laughed, and finally, at Josiah Trent, who was currently shrinking into his expensive wool suit. She didn't own a single debt. She owned the whole damn board. Cora slowly folded the papers back into the oilskin folio and tucked it securely into her coat. She slid off her horse, her boots hitting the frozen mud with a heavy, deliberate Times thud. She walked past Boone, up the wooden steps, and stopped inches from Trent. The mayor shrank back, his eyes darting frantically to the townsfolk for support. No one moved. No one made a sound. "The mercantile is closed, Josiah," Cora said. Her voice was no longer the dry, cracking leaf from the church. It was hard iron. "Pack your ledgers and whatever fits in a saddlebag. You are evicted from my town." Trent opened his mouth, a desperate, wet sound escaping his throat, but no words came. He looked at Cora's cold brown eyes, then at the massive, scarred mountain of a man standing behind her in the street, his hand resting casually on the bone handle of his hunting knife. Trent turned and hurried into the store. Cora stood on the porch, looking out over the silent town of Oakhaven. The freezing wind whipped the hem of her wolf fur coat. She looked down at Boone. The faint, permanent grimace of his scar hadn't changed, but there was a quiet, unmistakable glint of respect in his pale eyes. He hadn't bought her to own her. He had bought her to arm her. "We need flour," Cora said, her voice carrying through the quiet street, "and salt. Load it up, Boone. We're going home." Did this story of frontier justice and quiet resilience keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved watching Cora take back her power and silence the town of Oakhaven, hit that like button and share this video with fellow story lovers. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss another gritty, emotional tale from the Wild West. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Cora's boots?